So could you give us a brief background about your experience as an OT and how you found yourself working in this practice area?
Oh, sure, sure. I've been an occupational therapist for, oh gosh, over 35 years. And I graduated with a bachelor's degree in occupational therapy when that was the terminal degree
Yeah.
from Western Michigan University. Go Broncos. Have to put in a plug for our Broncos. And I did eventually go on and get a master's degree in human development and a PhD in education. But so I practiced, gosh, for, about 20 years. And a bulk of my practice was in pediatrics, working in, with children and their parents. I did early intervention, outpatient pediatrics practice, school-based practice. I had a small private practice, and always had a very significant interest in working with children and their families. In fact, my master's thesis and my dissertation were both attachment-related studies. So, very, very much committed to the parent-child relationship. So kind of a history of my basic practice, but gosh, about a little bit more than 15 years ago or so, it was during a busy time in my life. And that's when I was writing my first occupational therapy assistant textbook. And I was doing my finishing up my research for my dissertation and starting to do the writing for that. And I was teaching in a psychology program 3/4 time, and a small practice, and planning our son's bar mitzvah. So, but as all good OTs would say, oh, it's all in a day's work.
All in a day's work. I love that.
But it happened to be a very, very beautiful spring day. And I should preface this by saying I'm a lifelong lover of nature. I love gardening. I love being outside. And especially during these really, really challenging times, being outside is, I think, what's keeping me remotely sane, my daily walks, but that's about it. But anyway, so it was a really beautiful afternoon, and my son and I were both in the study working and doing our homework, if you will. And I just kind of lost it, and I started being quite obnoxious, which is pretty atypical for me. I totally was just screaming at the computer, and not at our son. But anyway, he just stopped his work, and he just really, really quietly said, "Hey, Mom, why don't you go outside in your garden for a little while?" And I stopped dead in my tracks. Out of the mouth of a babe, a little one.
Yeah.
And I said, okay. So I did. And I went outside, and I spent 20 minutes, just doing the garden things, poking around and smelling the herbs, doing a little bit of weeding, and looking at the sky and feeling the breeze on my shoulders. And after 20 minutes, I was fine. I was fine. I was rejuvenated, and I was calm, and I was collected. And so I went back inside, and I was able to get right back to work and just sort of pick up the pieces, if you will. And I was flabbergasted. I had no idea what had just happened to me. All I did was go outside. Well, a little bit more than all I did was go outside. So, being a very curious person, I wanted to know what had happened, and began really, really going through, which at that time was somewhat limited literature about, the sort of transformative impact of nature. And it's there. And, it's becoming more and more of a very popular area of research, linking both physical and mental health to experiences of, connecting with nature, be it even inside or outside. But anyway, so I began to say, well, that's really, really, really interesting. But I also wanted to know if, there was any connection between nature and health and occupational therapy, because why not? And what I learned was that, early on when our profession was founded, we did use nature. We used gardening as, a very impactful intervention, particularly with patients with mental health issues and veterans. But along the way, kind of didn't do it as much. And never have we been allowed voice in using gardening as intervention. But we do use it. We're just not showing we're just not engaging in research. So then I just began to, and then I began, in this sort of whole, what is this all about? I began to learn about healing gardens and therapeutic gardens. And I thought, wait a second, these gardens, and they're phenomenal and wonderful, they're being designed by landscape architects. But where is the connection with a therapist?
Yeah, and that's where you come in.
Exactly.
That's
So
awesome.
that's what that's what I've really focused on.
Yeah, I love that. So do you think like with starting out with kids and then with your love of nature and being outside is kind of how that like adapting playground equipment kind of like cultivated itself, for a pun there?
Good fun. I think so. I think so in many ways. I do work with landscape architects now, as the therapeutic design consultant or therapeutic designer, with, whatever term they choose to use with my involvement.
Right.
But I certainly love every project that I'm involved with, be it a project for children or be it a project, for anyone along
Right.
the lifespan. But my sweet spot is work with children,
Yeah.
gardens or playgrounds for children. Yeah, that's
Perfect. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
So looking at I was obviously visiting your website and doing some research. I noticed some certifications you had, and one was healthcare garden design. How do you think that has helped you with modifying playground equipment?
I don't know that I could give you a direct link between the certification and healthcare garden design, except that the certification process, the course, helped me to better understand sort of the holistic therapeutic design process. So, I think it's a great foundation, but I would say that the knowledge base for adapting playground equipment really comes deep through my understanding of what occupational therapy is.
When looking at your website, you touched about, you just were briefly talking about these, but you assisted on the design of the Wounded Warrior, Walter Reed, National Navy Military, an award-winning sensory garden with children with autism, the Serenity Garden, a therapeutic garden for veterans, the redesign of a community mental health center, serving on the design team for 2 American Society Landscape Architects award-winning therapeutic gardens. Could you tell us more about your role? You don't have to be super specific with each one, just kind of what your general role was, just so we can get a little bit of a glimpse of what that might look like.
Sure. The role varies between projects. The most impactful projects in my mind are those in which I'm brought in as a consultant from day one, when the project has just been awarded to the design team, because at that point it's a blank slate, or maybe everyone's got ideas, but it's a little bit more open. Sometimes I'm brought in halfway through a project. Sometimes I'm brought in after the initial concept design has already been completed, and sometimes it's like, okay, I think we could do a better job. So it varies. I would say, a couple of projects that I actually haven't put on the website yet are trauma-informed design projects for children. And in both of those, well, actually 3 of them, in all 3 of those projects, I've been there from day one. And most of the time, my role has been to actually create a design brief, kind of indicating, because, as an occupational therapist, we understand disability, we understand sensory integration, which I think is a huge component of my design work. And we really understand what a user needs to be able to do, and to be able to engage in the space meaningfully and purposefully and with dignity. So in developing the design brief, I'm able to say, well, this garden has to be able to, or this playground or this play space has to be able to convey, X, Y, and Z. And in my mind, I can visualize what the design has to look like. But even with this guiding information, then we as a team begin to put the ideas on paper and to sketch it out. So
Okay. That's awesome. So is there any other OT theories or frame of references used, or mostly just sensory negation?
and PEOP.
POP.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What are some challenges you have faced when designing adaptive equipment? I'm sure it would probably be more difficult if you're entering kind of halfway, like you were mentioned, versus like really starting out. But
Yep.
is there other things?
Well, sometimes, you know, one has to be very respectful of other people's perspectives. And I feel like, you know, I'm very good at that. Just to not have an attitude like I have the answers and you have to listen to me. It's a give and take process. And so I think, you know, although I don't know that it's a challenge, I'd like to think of it more as an opportunity to be able to really communicate, you know, my perspective and how can we work together to find this common ground to, you know, create these adaptive spaces, you know, playground spaces or adaptive equipment. And it's just a matter of listening. And the other thing too is I have worked really, really hard to understand the language of landscape architecture so that I can be a good communicator. And likewise.
Oh, I love, yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Try to encourage
that's
those
perfect.
designers I work with to learn my language, our language.
Okay.
Yeah, some favorite moments you have.
Sorry.
Oh gosh, it's funny. I would say that every project is my favorite moment. I'm currently working on an adaptive playground project in Sacramento, you know, and it's certainly pretty wild to be doing it remote, but that's how we have to do it.
Yeah.
And, you know, favorite moment is we're a really, really interesting team, you know, several landscape architects, myself, an adaptive playground consultant who has a playground organization because her child has a disability, and that was sort of her inspiration to develop this organization. And I think favorite moments is we are so in sync in our thinking. You know, the concept ideas that the landscape architects are presenting are really good, and we really share this common vision of really creating a space that's going to, you know, maximize usability for all the children. And I think a really favorite moment is one of the really important things for children with disabilities, particularly those who have ambulatory issues, is getting to play at height. You know, typically their, you know, perspective is at the ground, but children like to go up high and play. And we are designing what I think is going to be absolutely monumentally innovative in terms of play at height for everyone. The inclusive nature of this structure as it's coming along is positively amazing.
Oh, that's so cool.
We just were able to talk through ideas.
Yeah, that's so cool. Kind of going on with that, is there any, so that would be something like new that you're super excited about. Is there any other like specific equipment that you really like to use, like as far as like breaking down actual equipment pieces?
I'm very interested in playground equipment that provides a lot of proprioceptive input.
Okay.
I think that's really, really important for self-regulation.
Yeah.
And so that's one of my favorite things. I think the other thing too is being really aware of interoception, you know, the internal functioning, and really thinking about that being an important consideration in design, particularly when you're designing playgrounds, you know, that are inclusive or adapted, you know, being sure that there's ample opportunities for shade, you know, because if children get hot, or opportunities to have drinks of water, or, you know, something as, it's not simple and it's not at all, but providing restrooms and of course adaptive things, you know, those are important. But I would say in terms of you know, actual equipment, again, I'll back into, you know, proprioception.
Okay.
Opportunities are really, really important.
Okay. So then once you've completed a design project, or is there any like follow-up stuff that you do, or stuff like that?
Sometimes. You know,
Okay.
that to me is at this point an under-tapped resource, if you will, to engage in some type of, you know, what's called a post-occupancy evaluation, not to be confused with PEO, but POE. I get them mixed up altogether too often.
Yeah.
So, you know, a post-occupancy evaluation is typically done about 6 months after a project is completed, and you really take some type of a measurement tool to look at the usability of the space, if you will.
Okay.
But I think that in many of our projects, there's ample opportunity to do some type of really nice evidence-based research. One project that I just completed as an academic project, I worked with one of my colleagues at Iowa State University to design a courtyard garden with some play equipment in it, of course, at a residential facility for children with very severe mental health issues. And we do have a grant to engage in some research. But, you know, with COVID-19, everything is delayed, including even the installation of the garden. So
Okay.
that's probably going to be a couple of years down the road, but we do have some funding to look at the impact of this outdoor space.
So just like a few wrap-up questions. As future OTs, is there anything you would like us to take away from regarding the importance of adaptive equipment? I know you've kind of easy to grasp that based off all of the amazing things that you've said, but any list, like, finishing thoughts on takeaway points?
Sure. I think some really important takeaways are that we as occupational therapists are trained and we really understand adaptation. You know, sometimes I take for granted that the way I think is how everybody else thinks. But, you know, as you know, come close to emerging into our world of our wonderful profession, you're going to understand that we see the world differently. And, you know, everything I see, I can almost see, you know, how could it be better, if you will, or what could you do to increase access or increase the usability to enable more people to, you know, use a space or a product or whatever. I think an important takeaway is to really value how you think as an occupational therapist, and to always, you know, be bold and brave and willing to take the risk to say, you know, this is, you know, a terrific start, but it could be better.
Could be better.
Yeah, it's just a wonderful way to promote the value of our profession. And the other thing too is I want to talk just for a second, if I could, about innovation.
Of course.
I have a lot of students, you know, approach me. You know, they're interested in the work I do. It's very unusual in our profession, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do it. And, you know, as a new graduate, it's potentially very hard to, you know, say, well, I'm going to hang out my shingle and I'm going to, you know, do something completely different and innovative. When you start as a new graduate, certainly, you know, maybe a more traditional role is an important place to start, but it doesn't mean that you can't begin to sort of implement your ideas. You know, one example is if you're doing school-based practice and you're interested in nature, as, you know, or playground, you know, adaptive playgrounds, as you can, you know, bring the children outside when COVID's over, or perhaps we're going to be outside doing all of our schooling.
Everything.
Yeah. But, you know, think about, you know, how can you take your ideas and begin to put them into practice as you begin to really craft your skill as a practitioner. Yeah. And the other thing too, and I've been very, very blessed to have several mentors in the world of landscape architecture, to find a mentor, someone who, you know, is really interested in what, you know, you're doing, any type of, you know, unique practice, and to help them guide you.
So when I'm thinking about like playground equipment I've been around and stuff, I've really only seen adaptive playgrounds, very minimally adaptive, but in like Grand Rapids, so like an hour and 30 minutes away from where I live right now, and then nothing in my area. what would be something that I could do as a student to kind of pursue getting, just like advocating for the kids that are in my area so they can have adaptive playground equipment too? What would be something that I could do?
I think that you could do a number of things. You know, you could start by contacting the local Parks and Recreation Department.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, playgrounds do have to meet minimum standards. You know, there are, you know, national standards for playgrounds, and they do have to meet minimum accessibility standards, but we can do better than accessible. We can be inclusive,
Yeah.
and inclusive means that they, you know, they're for everyone, regardless of ability or cultural preferences and such. But to approach the, you know, the Parks and Recreation Department and find out, you know, what's going on with their vision for playgrounds in your community. And if there's even some hint of redesigning or even evaluating the playgrounds for, you know, accessibility and inclusivity, to say, you know, hey, I'm an occupational therapist, and this is something that I'd really be interested in working with you on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a good place to kind of go to your local municipalities and find
Yeah.
out, or even, you know, your local school districts, and see, you know, what the thinking is.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. That this was such a good meeting. I love talking to you. You're so passionate and you're so informative, and it was such a pleasure getting to know you a little bit through this interview.
My pleasure. And